welcome to the podcast, Amazing Tales from Off and On Connecticut's Beaten Path. I'm your host, Mike Allen. You know, it was about 300 years ago that the 1,000 inhabitants at that time of Windham, Connecticut, were awakened by a very loud, scary noise not too far from their village. They were certain, during these times of the French and Indian War, that they would soon be under attack. It was pitch black. They couldn't see what was making the noise, but they would learn the following morning and wait until you hear. Jamie Eves is our guest today. He's the interim director and senior curator of the Mill Museum in Windham. He knows his story inside out. It's a fascinating tale, and he's going to be along in a moment with that story. This week's trivia question: they mutinied against their kidnappers aboard a ship, killing the captain, and were subsequently tried for murder in a case that went to the Supreme Court. Who were they? Well, stick around after the main program, because then you're going to know the topic for next week's show. Amazing Tales from Off and On Connecticut's Beaten Path is brought to you by our sponsor, Yale New Haven Health. When people need the best quality health care, there's a reason they turn to Yale New Haven Health. In 1826, Yale New Haven Hospital became Connecticut's very first hospital. They were the first hospital in the U.S. to use chemotherapy. Yale New Haven was the first to introduce insulin pumps for diabetic patients, and they introduced the world's first intensive care unit for newborns. For more information about Yale New Haven Health, visit ynhhs.org. That's ynhhs.org. I want you to imagine for a moment that you're a colonial settler from England. You've come to rural Connecticut back in the 1700s to try and eke out a living. All the trees were chopped down everywhere to build houses and wagons and keep all those fires going to cook food and even stay warm during the cold months. And uncertainty about your safety, especially at that time during the French and Indian War. You see, back in the 1750s, virtually every resident of Connecticut was British. The Revolutionary War would still be 2 decades away. And as a Brit, well, you'd be fighting the French. Nothing new there. But in this particular war, the different Native American tribes picked sides. Some went with the French, some went with the British, and added a whole new flair to the idea of warfare. Well, you had heard the stories of all the bloodshed, the horrible battles, the sneak attacks in the middle of the night and the like, and well, you were afraid you or your family just might be next. And this concern, of course, was particularly bad at night. The new moon phase, when the sky was pitch black and you couldn't see anything, that was the particularly scary time. And if something went bump that night, well, it could be downright frightening. So the stage is now set for that summer night in the mid-1700s in the small rural town of Windham. That very loud noise that woke them up, it wasn't just one noise, it kept going. And the whole town said they had never heard anything like it before. Some thought it was war drums. A couple even said the Judgement Day. Well, here to tell the story and clear up the mystery is Jamie Eves. He's the interim director and senior curator at the Mill Museum in Windham. So, Jamie, we're going to try and keep this a little bit secret as to what actually happened that night, keep people in a little bit of suspense. But let's start off by framing what it was like living in rural Windham in the 1750s. You had a lot of concern and tension and worry about possibly being attacked by either the French or Native Americans during the French and Indian War in 1756, which is about when this happened. And so people were kind of on edge, and anything could maybe put them over the edge. Could you describe what you understand of what it was like in Windham in those days?
Windham was a rural community. It was a fairly large rural community because it was the county seat. It actually had a village in it, which would have had a courthouse and a jail and some offices and shops. Like the rest of New England, it was hearing things from the frontier. A number of the wealthier people in Windham had invested in frontier land in Pennsylvania, so the frontier was much on their mind. And the various wars that had occurred between Britain and France, the French and Indian Wars, had been going on since the late 1600s. And so there was a fear that people had, a realistic fear, that a raiding party could show up at any time. It never actually did in Connecticut, but it did in Massachusetts, in Deerfield, and that wasn't far away, and people heard about that. And so they were on edge, as people would be in a time of war when they're worried they might be attacked.
A lot of my questions are based on a compilation of this event that was put together by the Wyndham Historical Society. And they say that it was a very dark, starless night in the month of June, and suddenly a loud noise started to be heard. And maybe you could walk us through, what do you know of what happened that night?
Sure. The first thing to say is it is actually not known historically not only what year, but even exactly what month. So some of this is conjecture and based on some stories that got passed down, oral traditions that were passed down. But the belief is, and would have been in the middle of the summer, and that there was a very loud noise that broke out in the middle of the night. All nights would have been dark. There was not light pollution back then as there is today. And if it was at all cloudy and covering up moon and stars, it would have been pitch black. And that's what people would have lived with during the nighttime. And then this noise begins that is universally described by people who remembered it as a sound that was loud and raucous and not like anything they had ever heard before.
Now, Parson White, who was, I guess, the top parson in town, or the only parson in town, one of his assistants heard it, brought it to his attention in the middle of the night, and I guess he raised the alarm. And if I have my facts right, at that point in time, Wyndham consisted of about maybe 1,000 citizens. Is that right?
That sounds about right. And indeed, that's the story most frequently told. It was an enslaved man who had been out and had heard the sounds and came back and reported that this racket was going on. But of course, White would have, as soon as he woke up, would have heard it himself. It was very, very loud.
So now everybody comes out. They're worried sick hearing these sounds, and at least some people thought that it could be like a war drum session with Native Americans who were maybe planning to attack. And even others, as I heard the story, thought maybe it was the Day of Judgment.
All of those explanations have come down in oral traditions. And so it's likely different people believe different things, just as you suggest. And so one of the stories is, some people did think it was the Day of Judgment. Probably most of them did not think that. Some people thought, quite rationally, that it might be a war party. Marauding French and Indians could have shown up. It could have been a war party. They just didn't know what it was. But when you don't know what a loud noise is, it can be frightening.
So, as best we know the story, they're all gathering around the town green of Wyndham, and the noise seems to be coming from an area known as Frog Pond, about a mile away down today's current Route 15, which was, I guess, a major dirt path in town at the time. How did the town respond to this? They got the able-bodied men to go figure this out?
More or less, that's pretty much what happened. A number of people did gather on the town green, probably the idea of safety in numbers. Those who had muskets likely brought them with them, which would have been a sensible thing to do. The sounds seemed to be coming from the east over a hill. That's where Frog Pond was. One oral tradition says that in the darkness, several of the men climbed to the top of the hill and fired their muskets blindly into the night, but it did no good. And so they thought, let's just stay together on the green. It's unlikely the entire town was there, but a good number of them probably showed up. And again, that's a sensible thing to do. Something strange is going on. You don't know what it is. It could be a war party. And we know, at least we now know, as Americans after 9/11, how frightening it can be when you are attacked on your own soil. It's easy to believe that the attack might be something worse might be happening and looming over there. So they would have been huddled in whatever night clothes they would have worn.
Now, in preparing for our discussion today, I had pulled out Google Maps, which I love, and I sort of mapped out this area. So I found the Wyndham Town Green, I found Frog Pond, and in between the two is something called Mullen Hill Road, which is, I guess, where these ardent writers went that night. They rode up to the top of Mullen Hill, and that's where they were firing from. And I heard that even some hid behind stone walls.
Would have been sensible to do that. That's how New Englanders fought battles in those days. My guess is they didn't stay very long because they couldn't see anything, that it was too dark. And you fire a few shots and nothing happens, probably be a good idea to get back to the town green.
So now the next morning, the sun comes up, they're able to see, and the team of men go down to the area where the sound came from. What did they find?
What they found is they got to the frog pond, and the frog pond, which wasn't called the frog pond at that time, it was the mill pond, and it generated water power for a sawmill and a grist mill. And when they got there, they discovered surrounding the pond and floating in the pond the bodies of dead frogs. They were astonished, didn't know this was going to be frogs. They hadn't identified the sound as frogs. They would have been familiar with what frogs sounded like. So whatever noises the frogs were making would have been very different from what they were used to. And there were frogs all over the place. Hundreds, perhaps thousands of dead frogs. And it was a mystery. And they wondered what in the world caused all this. The thought that they had was the frogs were fighting each other. And that's probably the best explanation. In their battling, they had been loud and had shrieked, and it sounded more like people than like frogs.
Now, some of the townspeople in Wyndham were also holders of state offices or, participated in state politics and government. I understand that some of them really didn't want to repeat this story because they were embarrassed by what they had mischaracterized.
Well, it was embarrassing. They were foolish enough not to know what frogs sounded like, and they couldn't figure out the mystery. But you're not going to keep something like that secret for very long. Word quickly got out. The people who would have been there would have been Colonel Dyer, Colonel Elderkin. They were important political people. Dyer would later on serve in the Stamp Act Congress and in the Continental Congress. He was a big advocate of the boycotting English imported goods in the early days of the American Revolution. He's even described by John Adams, who served with him in the Continental Congress. Elderkin would be a close advisor to the governor of Connecticut during the Revolutionary War and would build a gunpowder mill to help supply gunpowder to American soldiers. So these were important people in state politics as well as local politics, but they were also on the Patriot side. So the first written account we have of what happened doesn't show up for a few years. It comes out towards the end of the Revolutionary War by a guy named Peters, who was from Hebron, and Peters was a strong loyalist. He didn't like the Patriots. And indeed, the Patriots in Hebron drove Peters out of the new state of Connecticut. He actually moved to England, where he lived the rest of his life. And Peters wrote the first history of Connecticut. It is considered today maybe the least accurate of all histories of Connecticut. He made up a lot of stuff. Peters would have been a student at Yale at the time of the frog fight, and so would have heard about it. And he used it as an opportunity to denigrate Patriot leaders. And so he concocted a fanciful story where the frogs marched through the village of Wyndham and that the men all ran away to hide because that's what they would do, he thought. The women all fainted or even themselves died of fear. And then the men come back and hear the sound and think the frogs are speaking in French and try to speak to them in French and eventually figure out that they're frogs and then slaughter them. And that's what the noise was. And that it was happening actually in the village of Wyndham. None of that is very likely. There are all kinds of flaws to Peter's story, including, the vast number of frogs he describes as an army 40 yards wide as it's marching through Wyndham. No road at colonial times could have accommodated an army of that size. And so he creates this. And this is the story that's really picked up. It's picked up by people who live in other towns in Connecticut who think it's funny to make fun of people in Wyndham. And Dyer did have a reputation as a stuffy old lawyer, and people thought it was fun to make fun of him. And it got picked up by a newspaper in Rhode Island. And Rhode Islanders think nothing is better than to make fun of people from Connecticut. And so they accepted and then embroidered on Peters' story, telling the story about a frog army marching through the center of Wyndham, and that the frog fight was a battle between humans and frogs, which almost certainly it was not.
I just love it. Now, they did have some fun with it in terms of kind of embracing it, though. I mean, several ballads, I think, have been written. There's an operetta, and tell me what the Wyndham Bank itself did about 80 years after the fact.
Well, the Wyndham Bank, and this is later in the 1800s, banks in those days made their own paper money. The federal government did not make paper money, it only made metal coins. So banks filled the need by printing their own money. They had the same legal status as a cashier's check that you would get today at a bank. The only problem with these so-called banknotes is they were only good if the bank remained in business, so they're a little risky. The Wyndham Bank actually printed up banknotes that had frogs on them. Copies of these still exist locally. I've seen them. They're pretty ornate. The Wyndham Bank knew the true story when it was making these. So the people in Wyndham not only celebrated and embraced the frog, they also wanted to correct the story. And that was done by a local historian in the 1840s and 1850s. And as it was getting close to the 100th anniversary of the frog fight, he wanted to know what happened. All the ballads up till that time had been written by people outside of Wyndham, and they're hilarious. And they're all based on Peters' account. In fact, if you want to, we don't know the tunes to these original ballads, but ballads had very similar tunes. You could sing them to the tune of Yankee Doodle if you wanted to. It works. And so what this guy, who was the town clerk, and he was a school teacher, and he printed a newspaper, and he was even in the legislature for a while. He's a strong vocal member of the Whig Party. His name was William Weaver. He interviewed people who had heard the story from their parents and from their grandparents. And he's the one who pieced together that it was actually the frogs fighting each other. So he wrote his own version up. And that's the story of the frogs fighting each other. That's the story that people in Wyndham embraced. You knew the story was going to be told. The operetta that was told later on is a bit fanciful, but I guess operettas are by nature. And that is in the second half of the 1800s and was quite popular, performed locally in Connecticut, and many people would have seen it. Weaver's version got into print and is available for anyone who wants to look at it. We can fast forward to the time we get into the 20th century and the 21st century. The people of Wyndham began to put frogs on their town seal and frogs on town official stationery. Today, there are frogs painted on some of the municipal vehicles. There are frogs everywhere in Wyndham. You can't go very far in Wyndham without seeing frogs, the best known of which are the 4 frogs that are statues, big bronze frogs at the 4 corners of our new bridge, which people call the Frog Bridge, which spans the Willimantic River and was erected in, I think, maybe 2001. And they're very fine statues of frogs.
They truly are a sight to behold, and whoever has not seen them, I guarantee you it's worth the drive. I've done it myself. It's wonderful. So let's get to the bottom line here. Does anybody know why these frogs battled each other?
No. There are theories that are out there. So one is there was a drought, and this could be, and so the frog pond was drying up. Another is that the miller was repairing his dam, and so he took down the dam, and let all the water out of the frog pond. So there would have been a lot of frogs. Why so many frogs were in one pond is difficult to tell. One theory is because of the drought. Frogs were migrating out of the hills. One thought is the bullfrogs were fighting each other because without water, I guess frogs can't mate. And so they were in a really bad mood. But, they might have been in a bad mood because the water went away. And nobody is really sure why they were fighting. But people who are frog experts do say that frogs do fight each other sometimes and that they do make very loud and peculiar noises when they do so.
Well, that wraps it up for this episode of Amazing Tales from Off and On Connecticut's Beaten Path. As you heard, there have been ballads, poems, and even an operetta composed about the frog battle. Here's one of my favorite stanzas from one of those ballads. And to this day, each Wyndhamite unto his little son relates how on a summer's night the bullfrog fight was won. I very much want to thank our guest for today's program, Jamie Eves. He's interim director and senior curator of the Mill Museum in Wyndham. The answer to this week's trivia question, the question again was, they mutinied against their kidnappers aboard a ship, killing the captain, and were subsequently tried for murder in a case that went to the Supreme Court. Who were they? The answer is slaves, taken from their home in Africa and arrested after their mutiny on board the ship Amistad. Next week on Amazing Tales CT, we're going to look at this incredible legal case surrounding one of the most racially charged cases ever to come before the U.S. Supreme Courts. Amazing Tales from Off and On Connecticut's Beaten Path is a production of True North Associates, LLC. This is Mike Allen. Be safe and stay healthy.